we should make a start. And I'm just trying to see if I can change the view a bit. Oh, lovely. Yeah, that's brilliant. Super. Very warm welcome, everyone, to this Sociological Review webinar. I'm simply delighted that you're here, and it's such a wonderful experience for us to share some of these thoughts with you. I'm Sweta Rajan-Rankin. I'm a reader in social work and sociology at the University of Kent, and I'm a general editor of the Sociology Review journal. I'm absolutely delighted to invite our wonderful panel who are here to share their thoughts. If you could briefly introduce yourself, that would be great. Dhriti.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. My name is Dhriti. My name is Dhriti Sonowal. So I am a doctoral student at the Center for the Study of Social Systems, Jawaharlal Nehru University. And so I'm currently based in New Delhi, India, but I'm originally from Assam, which is a state in the northeast of India. And my work sort of looks at the political elites of the state of Assam in the northeast of India. And I'm also in the I'm a member of the editorial board of the Sociological Review journal. So yeah, that's it. And I'm hoping to sort of have a conversation with all of you today. Yeah.
Lovely. Thank you. Carin.
Greetings, everyone. My name is Carin Runciman. I'm a senior lecturer in social policy at the University of Edinburgh. I'm also a visiting associate professor at the University of Johannesburg, where I'd spent the last 10 years prior to joining Edinburgh in 2022.
Lovely. Agata.
Hi, everyone. My name is Agata Lisiak. I'm Associate Professor of Migration Studies at Bard College Berlin, and I'm also on the editorial board of the Sociological Review. It's great to be here. Thank you.
Brilliant. Right. So let's talk a little bit about housekeeping in general. The event is 60 minutes. We'll have a panel discussion for about 40 minutes, and then hopefully 20 minutes for questions. We're really keen to keep that space open. Please do put your questions in the chat, and we'll also have lots of links in there for you to look at. While most of you are, really familiar, hopefully, with the Sociological Review journal, I do want to highlight this is the third and final of our brilliant summer sessions or summer webinar sessions that are hosted by the Sociological Review. We are also part of a wider foundation, the Sociological Review Foundation, which is a registered charity. It's completely, committed to advancing public understandings of sociology. Challenging taken for granted assumptions, looking for the sociological imagination in those liminal spaces between different disciplines. And it's really about creating a platform for thinking in alternate ways to mainstream generative ideas. In addition to the journal, which is marvelous, we also have twice yearly monographs that are published, and the foundation has a lot of activities to support early career scholars. This includes training, bursaries to attend writing retreats. It funds seminar series. So if you want to perhaps design your own seminar series, there's an option there. We also have a fellowship for a year, really exciting opportunity. We host and support a number of in-person and online events if you want to run them. And really, it's about opening up opportunities for our community. Rather than to keep those resources to ourselves, we have an open and access digital magazine. And we also have a newsletter. So in case you're not aware, please do look at the links that are in chat about the Sociological Review Foundation. We're very keen to not just be in the pages of the journal and to commit to a public sociology. Please do, if possible, look at and complete the feedback form. Nobody's favorite activity, but really helps us to kind of frame what we're doing for you and to make sure it's relevant. Just to also say this meeting will be recorded, and we'll post it on our Sociological Review YouTube channel. In case you've missed it or want to share it, that's absolutely fine. So just to kick off, why looking at Global South papers? Why do we need to think about peer reviewing Global South papers in this way? Very briefly, before I move to questions from our panel, I think the first thing I want to say is I use Global South in brackets and also EDI in brackets, contested terms that we could spend a whole hour just unpacking. The panel and I want to have a progressive dialogue about what to do about it rather than get stuck in linguistic contradictions. So there is truly an issue with knowledge production in the global north and a sort of consumption of knowledge in the global south. There are some issues with wanting to communicate between these two canons or these two different types of scholarship. And the real difficulties, I think, are how do we improve our practice if we have blind spots that make it impossible for us to change our practice? And so this is about being really open and critically examining our own biases as we explore these topics that are now coming up. So without further ado, I want to talk about 3 different types of themes we'll have in this webinar, focus themes. The first is around the missing canon. What do we do when we know there's a missing canon, but we keep reproducing the same work without opening up or letting that canon speak for itself? So I'd like to go to our panelist, Dhriti. Very warm welcome, Dhriti. And here are some challenging questions. I hope you can sort of help us think differently.
Yeah.
In your own words, what do you think are the main challenges faced by Global South scholars trying to publish in Western sociological journals?
Right. Yeah. Thank you, Sweta. First of all, I would like to thank you and the Sociological Review for getting us together to have this conversation today. What I want to how I want to address your question is speak from my experience being, an early career researcher, and also sort of draw in from the experiences that have been relayed to me by my colleagues and contemporaries in India, which is obviously in the global south, right? So for most of us, for most doctoral students, the peer review process itself, it comes as a very daunting part of our academic journey. Sending a paper through the peer review process begins with laying, multiple bets on, say, finding that specific journal that aligns with the research work that we are engaging in, identifying that specific requirement of the journal and aligning and realigning with the structure of the journal that the journal expects from us in such a way that, it has the least chances of desk rejections, right? So, I'm consciously sort of talking about these specific steps leading up to the publication of a paper, because often, these steps itself are taken in a sort of, taken for granted nature. We sort of assume to believe that, as scholars, we will figure it out on our own. We will sort of, figure it out as we move from one year of our doctoral dissertation, to the second year, right? So we're supposed to figure it out on our own. But what I think makes all of this, I guess, a problem, because at each and every step, there is some kind of a structural barrier that scholars oftentimes, they face, specifically when we are located in institutions and structures in sort of this global north, global south binary, and also in terms of how these same structures are replicated in, say, the context of Indian academia itself, right? So, what I sort of believe is that what usually entails first when it comes to the peer review publication process is that, the first, in India especially, and those who have joined us from India will know, or those who will listen to us in India will know, that, we have what is known as the UGC, which is the University Grants Commission, which is a statutory government body, that is sort of trusted with maintaining the standards of what is higher education in India, right? So, and to put it very openly, the UGC dictates a lot of the rules and regulations when it comes to, research work in India for us, for the research scholars based in India, right? And other than that, what the UGC in terms of publication, it does is sort of bring out these 2 lists of journals, which they have identified through the UGC protocols, which sort of, makes them as specific journals, which they identify as would be beneficial for, say, an ethical and a moral sort of, way of publishing, right? So that's what they identify these lists as. So now why these specific lists are important, specifically in the context of India, is because, to be published in a UGC listed journal means that, it has a higher chance of being reflected on your academic performance index score, right? And at the same time, I think this was like till last year, the idea of, or the factor that, you had to be published in a UGC listed paper within the running years of your PhD meant that, you could then only sort of, submit your PhD. You were not allowed to submit your PhD if you did not have a publication in a UGC listed journal. This was till the last year. But now the UGC has changed the rules, but that is another sort of a discussion that we can have. But now what I want, yeah.
Many of, oh, yeah, hello?
Yeah, sure.
Yes, many of what the things you're saying are probably going to resonate. All early career scholars, whether from India or anywhere else, it's hugely daunting. There is, a gatekeeping process, which keeps, that one thing is gatekeeping process. The second thing to say here is the social capital, economic capital that comes with publication. It's the way you get a job, the way you actually manage to live. So, to highlight that. But I do want to get your thoughts particularly on this idea of a missing canon. Because it's so hierarchical, because knowledge is produced in a way that even the UGC is saying, this is knowledge, that is not knowledge. So, for example, regionality here matters, right? National journals, international journals are somehow seen as higher quality. Anything that's regional is seen as clearly too specific. So there's a specialist generalist tension. There's also a regional national tension. And I really wanted to get your views, really important views. What do we lose when we use the frame of the global South and forget regional difference? What do we lose, for example, when we use the frameworks of race, ethnicity, migration? And almost expect that's what Global South papers are about. What do we lose in terms of other forms of analytical categorization that are important for regional social inequalities? Thank you.
Yeah. So I think all of these questions, I mean, it ties down to where we are also located institutionally, right? So when we talk about, so when I talk about, say, central universities, which are located in the metropolitan centers of, say, a particular say India, right? And then we talk about these metropolitan centers in other global South locations, right? So there itself, it comes to distinction in terms of which kind of research gets highlighted or spotlighted in these institutions itself. Say, for instance, if a scholar comes in from a remote location, say, I'm just speaking from top of my mind, if I say Northeast India, and he or she comes in with a particular kind of research, and when he or she sits before the panel, the interview panel in the PhD selection board, is that kind of research, what kind of research then gets selected, right? Does it have to be within the canons of, say, say caste studies, or does it have to be in the case of class studies, right? What does it mean to have an ethnographic voice of the community that you're speaking to? How sort of say a heavy theory building, does it sort of make you lose your ethnographic voice? So I think that becomes very important, and that question relates to, again, the institutional networks in which we are located in, and that becomes very important in terms of, say, what kind of peer-to-peer discussions are we having? So when we look at regional universities, when we look at, say, universities located not, say, in what we understand as the metropole, right? What kind of discussions are being generated? What kind of sociological, ideas are being bounced off each other, right? So all of these things then comes down to, again, the idea of the publication, sort of the political economy of publication, right? So when a paper is sent, which is very ethnography heavy, right? A paper which is sent, which is ethnography heavy, say about a remote community in the hills, to an international journal, and the journal responds back saying that, we don't have reviewers to sort of review this kind of work for you. So would you like to make it more theory heavy? Then what does that researcher do? Right. So how do we sort of, question the idea of whether, who are these knowledge makers, or then are we, as, scholars working in the global South, are we really responding only to the theories being produced there and being just, ethnographic I don't know, raw material providers, right? So I think those questions really, we need to look at it again in this political economy of publishing itself, and institutionally, structurally, where we are located. And we, as in, I mean, early career researchers, right? How do we sort of navigate through all of these structural barriers which we face in our everyday sort of academic life that we're trying to live, right?
Super. I mean, Dhriti, you've touched on so much right there. And just to pull out again some of the key points, really powerfully stated by you that, you know, some of these rich ethnographic accounts are seen as raw data. Or some other scholar tend to theorize and develop in a palatable way. In fact, it could be the blind spot is the journal doesn't have the educated knowledge of that context. It is the authorship is on the other end, wanting to read that ethnographic work. The journal does not have access to that missing canon, not Sociological Review per se, other journals as well. And as a result, this is something I have seen as both editor and reviewer. Quite often, Global South papers are rejected as being too descriptive. But that's because the onus of educating the reviewer of the context takes up all the space. First, you talk about India, then you talk about the state, then you talk about Assam, then you talk about Far East politics. At the end, you're out of words. And yet, if you're so specific in terms of the shaping of the case study without providing normative, you know, connective lines to something the reader knows. If you don't have your Foucault thrown in, if you don't have those markers to help someone, you know, make their brain think differently, then it's just seen as descriptive or too specific. And I think that's a huge problem, because whose responsibility is it to educate themselves about a context so they can access the argument? And I think that's really well made there. Brilliant. One more thing to kind of pull out from you, Dhriti, is the pressure that not just early career, but Global South academics face in referencing certain types of scholarship to show they are critical. Is that the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory? Is that Stuart Hall? Is that, you know, Spivak and so forth? Whereas you might just want to reference local, regional activist voices that are so much more relevant to your own specific work. But then again, there's this issue of educating the public or educating the journal or the authors, the community that reads your work on why they're important. So I guess last final comment from you, whose burden is it to dispel that missing canon?
I mean, one way for me to answer that would probably go back to the questions that I was having, you know, while we were having this discussion throughout the last month, is that, you know, where does the onus lie? You know, like, when we sort of, you know, look at, people are talking about decolonizing sociology, right? People are talking about decolonizing this, decolonizing that. Now, can we decolonize peer review? Right? Can we decolonize peer review? Right? So is that a valid question? Like, if it comes from, say, the Global South, then that will be looked at as sort of, you know, like a rebellious activist sort of a statement that somebody's making, you know, let's decolonize peer review itself. And then they'll be like, you know, okay, fine, you know, we're talking about standards now. So now we can't even maintain standards, you know, you're talking about decolonizing everything and this and that, right? So when we look at it through that perspective, I think then the answer or the solution, so to say, would probably lie in terms of, for what I think would be a proper peer-to-peer networking, not just within the institution, but across institutions. How do we bring institutions from across the board together to come to a common platform and really have, you know, intense conversations in terms of how do we get past this, you know, publish or perish kind of economy, right? So how do we get past this idea that, you know, you will be at a particular, you know, say, a position in your career only if you publish in an international journal, or you'll only be in a particular position if you publish in, say, a reputed journal, so to say, right? So how do we, so those kind of conversations, I feel, will only be, it'll be open, or it'll sort of be possible if people really get together, not just, like 4 of us here, but at a really larger scale. And how do we sort of try and, decolonize this whole idea that, we are sort of there to be your raw materials, and, we will only be, going there and being, taking up, doing this, that, right? So I think that's how I would sort of look at it. Yeah.
Absolutely beautifully said. Thank you so much, Dhriti. I'm sure there are going to be questions coming straight for you at the end. Moving on to Carin, let's play with that last thought a bit more around subject positionality particularly. As a reviewer and an editor, I've always been quite surprised that it's the papers from minoritized scholars or from the Global South, and that are very reflective, very open about their subject position, that actually use that theoretically and in an embodied way to talk about their connection with the research material. And other authors don't bother with it at all. There is a real sense of, I'm clearly legitimate. So why do I need to talk about whether I'm a man or I'm queer or I'm from Assam or from any other country? How does that resonate with you?
Yeah, well, that's also a nice précis into why am I on this panel at all, which was when you made the invitation was really the question that I had asked of you. I was very concerned that I was another white woman taking up space on panels of this kind of this type. But as I gave a little hint of the reason that I am sitting on this panel is because of mobilities. So I have spent more or less the last 10 years working in South Africa, having completed my PhD in the UK, but I've worked predominantly in South Africa. Now I find myself back in the UK again. So this mobility that I've had, that in a sense has also allowed me to see, not to say that there's only two sides, but two particular sides of the way in which scholarship and academia and publishing work from different positionalities. And I think what that, and it's really sort of interesting building upon, the previous discussion, so, a very obvious point to make here is just the infrastructural differences that we have. So, where I've been working with in South Africa, we now have regular daily blackouts. So you can sometimes go 8 to 10 hours a day without any electricity. So that's obviously a complicating factor in your ability to work. But also, and again, to talk about unevenness, again, talking about coming and working from South Africa is located in the Global South, but is also located within a privileged position within the Global South, where in comparison, especially to many of our neighbours on the continent, our higher education is relatively well resourced. We don't have the struggle of not being able to access a lot of the materials that you would want to be able to access, but knowing very much that many of my colleagues on the continent, that is the struggle that they face. They probably might not have access to the Sociological Review without handing over all of those lovely dollars or pounds or whatever currency these things get charged in. And I think these are things that from the centre can be very difficult to see. I think it can be very difficult to fully comprehend the ways in which knowledge production is happening in the Global South. And I think the other point that I wanted to draw out here was also a point about academic freedom. That particularly having worked on the African continent, a lot of the scholarship that is funded is that scholarship that fits within a development category, right? So it then creates conditions, structural conditions in which certain forms of scholarship are produced because it is the things that are funded. Your salary might depend on, conducting that form of research. And not to say that it means it's not possible for a sociological imagination to emerge in those conditions. But I think it does create certain pressures and makes it much more difficult. So, and again, as I say, I think having these wider conversations of actually really understanding the structural conditions in which knowledge production is happening in other parts of the world, trying to understand that better, I think is really critical to this conversation. Because just to make one further point, if we think about the dynamics around peer review, on the one hand, yes, definitely get more peer review, from scholars from the global south. But I do also think we have to think about how does that perhaps also unequally land on scholars from the global south when they might be teaching very large class sizes. So for instance, in the institution that I was in, our first year was more than 1,000 students. You were kind of alone to deal with that. And on top of all of the other things that you might be dealing with. So how does that, in a sense, yes, we want to, spread out the peer review to get those missing voices into the canon. But I think we do have to take that conversation carefully, because we can't also just displace it. There is also the responsibility on the scholars from the global north to decolonize, to use that word.
No, entirely. And it's a really helpful exercise that we're doing in the journal ourselves is looking at representation. How many Global South reviewers do we have, but actually how many authors do we have? Because there's a politics there as well. And I really do think Sociological Review as a journal, and I'm not just saying this because I'm an editor, genuinely has a real hunger for early career voices, diverse voices, and also because it gives them an opportunity to shape the lack of knowledge of what people want. If you sit on this side of peer review, you understand quite a lot about the process. And it's quite a useful thing to do anyway. But entirely so. I think the difficulties in terms of Global South scholarship, apart from infrastructure, is that reviewers located somewhere else where load shedding, as we call it in India, or blackouts, is not a problem. Internet. I've just come back from India, and we don't necessarily have a practice of having Wi-Fi at home. Very often you go to the cyber cafe, or to print you have to go somewhere else. It's about practices as opposed to access necessarily. And so you're thinking, just to print one article, I work on my laptop, then I go to the cyber cafe, then I go to the print shop. That's my day's work. Literally trying to deal with those timings and those issues, but also kind of looking at whose voices we are representing and the responsibility we have to those voices. There are so many stories that we are still unfolding. And there are so many politics associated with telling other people's stories. I think there are some issues there as well. There's no question. Could you speak a little bit to this notion of unpacking further what is the Global South? You've mentioned some obvious differences, the political differences in South Africa's location in Africa and the continent, and the privileges and problems, massive problems that come with that racial politic. But equally, there's different voices and perspectives of scholars of color located here in the UK and the space we take up as well, versus scholars who are located in the actual Global South. Do you think there's a South-South asymmetry in publishing politics?
Wow, I mean, it's a really
heavy question.
Huge, it's a really huge question, and one I feel a little bit daunted to answer. But yes, certainly, and maybe the best way in which I can speak about that is from the perspective of having worked in South Africa, which, again, to kind of make the crude examples, obviously there's much more nuance to what I'm saying, is the periphery in relation to the UK, where I'm now situated, but it's the centre in terms of its dominance in terms of African continental knowledge production, and becoming very aware of not just the regional differences within South Africa, but as I was mentioning, the very different conditions that colleagues in Zimbabwe and colleagues in Kenya face. And we, as part of the decolonisation movement and the way that it played out in South African academia, there was a big push towards for, further continental collaboration. But there was almost a way that this would come across also as like South African imperialism on the continent.
Yes, absolutely.
And again, partly for structural reasons, it was the South African funding councils that had the money, so we tend to retain the structural power, very similar to how the GCRF worked, where the money came from the UK, so the structural power remained in the UK, although we were working in low middle income countries, and all of the politics around that, around who is allowed to give direction, who's even trusted with research funds, right? We'll work with you, but we won't actually give you any of the money. So I think, all of that does create this really, really uneven terrain. But I think here is the positive. And again, having come from the South African perspective, what the student protests in South Africa, the fees must fall and the roads must fall, what they did not only for South African academia, but the way in which I think those conversations have reverberated means that we are now, I think, asking these questions, which we were not asking as publicly as we are currently doing 10 years ago. Maybe, you were talking with your colleagues, but to actually put these issues front and center, and I think also given our role here within the journal, and which is what we are doing, is to think critically as a journal. How do we respond to this? What is our role within these processes of knowledge production? And I think a very important part of the conversation today is also to admit that we don't necessarily have the answers. We might have some ideas, and that's also why we're opening up this conversation publicly, to hear from other people about what would you like to see a journal like the Sociological Review do. But I think this is what's positive, right? That with the manifesto, this is also a journal that is seeking to engage in these critical conversations and explore it more.
Absolutely. And as you just said, Carin, the political moment is in favor of South African scholarship, because now when we try to decolonize and take our baby steps in the UK, we're like, let's learn from the South African example. So for the first time, we're taking a learner position.
Yeah.
And that is really important. So it takes time for a political movement to gain legitimacy and make people think, oh, I must learn more. And linked to that, a less complex question, or perhaps more complex question. What is scholarship for? Is what I'm thinking to myself.
Yeah.
A lot of scholarship from the Global South is dealing with extremely deeply entrenched social inequalities that are affecting people's capacity to live, even live. We think about gender-based violence or racist attack or whatever. And so the political impetus, it makes sense. For example, I'm from India, a country without a welfare state is activism. It makes sense. That's where your energies will go. And certainly as a Global South academic, born and brought up in India, before I moved to the UK, there was a real sense that critical work and critical scholarship cannot be separate from activism. It's a decolonial framework through which we produce knowledge. And yet, how does one write critically in a scholarly way about a process that is so fluid? And so actually, a number of Global South papers get rejected because they appear polemic. They appear angry. They appear ranting.
Yeah.
And so it's almost like there's an emotional politics of the way you perform your anger.
Yeah.
It's not much of a question, but I think, where do you think there is a tension here between activist research and so-called institutionally accepted research, and how that voice comes from the Global South?
So again, maybe to kind of draw on my mobilities here, one of the most amazing things of having started my career in South Africa is that because of the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa, this idea that activism and scholarship go hand in hand is actually embedded into the way in which the social sciences, certainly in South Africa, operate, and sociology in particular, because of its history within the South African struggle. So I benefited enormously from that. So to some degree, it was only when I began to publish outside of South Africa these questions emerged, because before then I didn't need to explain why, you know, activism or something that might be regarded as polemical, you know, is also about scholarship. But I do think space is widening, but I think there's a danger in how it is widening. And I think some of the danger, certainly from a UK perspective, is the way in which impact is being talked about, and the way in which the neoliberal university is now seeking to legitimise those forms of knowledge production. And in some ways that's great, right? Because it does mean that we can get that kind of voice and scholarship out. But I think we do need to be very wary of what are the downsides here, and in a sense, how is our work being appropriated by a neoliberal academy, which is a whole other seminar, I think. So totally. Maybe I should just leave it there.
No, exactly. And just to sort of tie that together with what Dhriti has already said, we forget that producing knowledge is an act of resistance. There is no place in the world where you produce knowledge that is not political in some way or the other. And, you know, you mentioned academic freedom, and I just want to touch on that again. A number of countries, for all kinds of reasons, certain political views will just not be tolerated if they're spoken against. I mean, India, we have this the BJP government, certainly, and, you know, pro-Muslim sentiment, pro-secularism, in some areas, some universities, some employment spaces, that's going to get you in trouble. So we forget the resistive politics of even what we're doing and why we're doing it. And we have to kind of remain humble about that, I think. Marvelous. Thank you so much, Carin. And if we go to our wonderful speaker, Agata. Agata, I want to now ask you a related question more openly. Is there a whiteness bias in peer review from your point of view?
Is it a yes or no question?
No, not at all. And what do you think it looks like? Like, how does it manifest? Yeah.
Right. So I thought about this when I was invited to the panel, for which I'm very grateful. It's been amazing to be here today with you and to learn from you and from our meetings earlier on in preparation. Because it's, you know, it's a provocative but seemingly naive question, right? Like, how does whiteness manifest in peer review? Is it even possible, you know, in a context where you're confronted with a paper, you know, on paper, if you can print it out, or on the screen, you know, like, where do you see race, right? And I believe it manifests in several different ways. You know, when it comes to citation politics, right? That's one big one, and it's not. I don't mean it in a way that would reproduce those sort of very simplistic DEI or EDI logics that, oh, you need to have a certain number or like certain diversity in your citation, in your citations for this to count as a paper that does not reproduce whiteness. I mean, it's more about the level of actual engagement and engaging with scholarship that is also geographically diverse. If your work in a particular, like, it's not going to be the same for everyone, I think. Like, if you focus in your research on something that is extremely regional, you will be mostly engaging with theories, you know, from that place and about that place, and also, you know, with scholarship that is very, very specific in many cases. And we talked about it also earlier on today, how important it is to do that, right? To also to engage with not only national but also local and regional scholarship on in those cases. But I mean, a real openness to scholarship that is that supports sociological imagination beyond the methodological nationalism and beyond the borders. So that's one way in which I see it manifest. Another way, and here I don't mean to conflate whiteness with the global north, because as we discussed, it's you know, it's a contested term, and also the global north is not white, not all white, the global south is not all non-white, right? So it's not about that. It's more about the what is the dominant, what is the norm, the accepted norm, the embodied norm that manifests through language. So here again, like we could look at Bourdieu, but we can also look at other writings on the political economies of language. And that, when I mean the tone, I don't only mean like the level of English that the writer represents, but also the sort of the freedom to experiment that they have, right? How they can push the very rigid and formulaic templates of academic paper publishing, right? That the moment when you feel very much at home in a language, and that language happens to be the dominant language of the global north publishing, it's, it just brings you further. And again, here, whiteness is not dimensional because it has many different shades, right? And it intersects with class and gender. And I think another point that in which whiteness manifests is what is left unexplained in the paper. The assumption that the reader should know this, and here again, whiteness as a like many shades, not necessarily, like in a strongly racialized terms, but if we agree that universities and the publishing industry in the global north, which dominates the global academic publishing, that they are very much shaped by whiteness and that they continue to reproduce whiteness, then what is left unsaid, because it's assumed to be known that your readers must know this, I think it's very telling. And that's why, and I think it's one of the biggest blind spots, actually, like when we look at peer reviewing. And Dhriti spoke so powerfully about, like this expectation to explain yourself to your readers and reviewers in the global north. And I would propose, and I try to do that as a peer reviewer, that we put more effort into provincializing the knowledge production in the global north and from the global north, and that we don't assume that people will just get those references, right? So I try to urge the writers of the papers I review that they write for a global audience, not for a global north or national audience, and that writing to a global audience, they should not assume that this is the norm or common knowledge, right? Because this common knowledge is like, it's very strongly localized. It's localized in the global north in this case, right? And to be frank, like this is a lesson that I learned from working on the podcast Spatial Delight, because I was trying to, write in a way that does not assume that the listeners know certain things that in social sciences may seem obvious, right? So, or that may seem obvious to listeners in the UK, but they are not necessarily obvious to everyone else in the world. So I wouldn't just say Thatcher, I would say British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, right? Because it needs to be explained. And so that would be my, like the biggest takeaway from the reflections on this would be to not to just look at the global south, what can be done, but also look at the global north and see how we can provincialize that
entirely. That's really, really helpful. And in fact, I was thinking about Gurminder Bhamra's work on methodological whiteness. And that's a really powerful connection to make here, because there is also a tension with empiricism. So in a number of countries, including the global north, evidence doesn't exist unless it's measured in a specific way. So then you're fighting to make a case for lived experience. And storytelling that's not based on formal interviews, but being there, being present. That's the ethnographic method and approach. But I have been thinking a great deal about whether there's a blind spot in ethnography, because of course, ethnography is about studying often a community that's not your own. And that's why that also produces another extractive politics, with white scholars going to Assam to study different communities, or having to go away from your own comfort zone And yet it creates exoticism and, a sort of fetishization of this wonderful place that you've just gone and seen and so forth. So methodologies and the ways in which we study things matter greatly as well. But one of the great challenges of whiteness is its slippery, perverse capacity to hide in plain sight. And as a social work academic, I frequently teach about whiteness and tell them I have tremendous white privilege. I'm a Hindu Brahmin in India. Are you kidding? I have access to a caste-based privilege. They don't see that. They see a brown woman. They don't see that there's such a difference, that such a difference could be possible. And so I've had to do a lot of thinking about, this sort of extractive politics of Brahminical writing and caste-based oppression, even in my own context. And what does it look like to decolonize a canon that served me? And how I was complicit. So it's really helpful to look in your own context and think, what voices are heard, what voices are silent, and who's hearing, who's listening? Who's listening? And so just to finish up, because we do want to leave some time for questions, last final thoughts, blind spots. What are one blind spot that you think we need to work on to promote a more open, embracing attitude to global South scholarship? Dhriti, nice and quick.
I think we need, I think all journals should have a redressal and feedback mechanism in place, instituted. And I think the peer network again should really go back and, we should really check whether those objectives are being fulfilled by the journals or not. Yeah.
Brilliant. Carin?
It's a really huge question, and I knew you were going to ask it, and I still don't know if I have an answer.
That's fine.
which is in a sense the essence of a blind spot, right? You don't know you've got it.
Yeah.
But I'm wondering if the question that is in the chat here from Lucy Parry, does Sociological Review provide guidelines for peer reviewers to encourage these kind of reflections? And I just went quickly to, because I know we do have guidance, I went to look quickly at it. And I am wondering if this is actually an area we should be developing guidance for peer review.
Massively, and actually it's a good segue towards our Q&A. Lucy, great question. I think the answers really are present in the manifesto in a loosely formed way. But the manifesto clearly says, we understand sociology doesn't just happen in sociology departments. That spoke to me. I'm in a social work department. It spoke to me. People in organizational studies do it. In development studies are sociologists. So this notion of embracing, expansive, and the manifesto talks about opening up, not closing down arguments. For me, that is the most convincing way to understand what you're looking for. What is being communicated, what's being opened up, even if it's being opened up in an angry way, even if it's being opened up in a polemic way, even if it's actually, the purpose is to shake someone awake, And I do want to kind of go to Agata, and then we'll go into Q&A. Agata, thank you very much, Carin. Agata, any blind spot that you think, this is the one we need to work on?
I already mentioned the one on that global North scholarship is not provincialized enough in the global North institutions and publications. But another one relates to something that you mentioned earlier, Sweta, about academic freedom and the dangers to academic freedom in the global South. In a similar way, I think a blind spot in the global North is not to consider the dangers to academic freedom in the global North. And they can also manifest in the peer review process and in the publishing process. And this is something that my colleagues have been working on. I'm going to link their book on academic freedom and precarity in the global North. It's a fantastic collection with perspectives from various geographies and various disciplines, but mostly in social sciences, that problematize this relegating of issues with academic freedom to, authoritarian regimes in the global South, while not noticing the many constraints to academic freedom, also those based in economic precarity, in employment and labor precarity in the global North.
Entirely, thank you. And just to kind of also reflect on my own blind blind spot check. We have to be really critical about what we mean by quality. A peer reviewer, in effect, is providing exactly that, a critical review. But we should not take the role of us being gatekeepers, or be aware, very aware of the gatekeeping role, the power. There is power. And for me, what is the purpose of scholarship? Is it consciousness raising? Or is it tick the box and join the club? It often is both. But as a reviewer, if you start thinking about consciousness raising or, really opening up debate, then you look at a paper in a different way. But if you scrutinize a paper for quality in this really narrow formulation, that can be an issue. Brilliant question from Smarika. If you don't mind putting your camera on, it'd be great to see you. But here's the question. Smarika says, true, when we write about inequalities, decolonization, and racism, it is seen as angry and also unscientific. How can we pursue such uncomfortable topics in research when there is so much resistance from gatekeepers like education institutions and some peer reviewers? Entirely bang on, right? That's such an important question. And it makes me think greatly, Smarika, of who gets to do risky research based on their context. And what is the emotional burden of studying something close to your own life or subject position? It can be tremendously painful to write about racism. There's an emotional labor involved in even excavating that kind of work. So, just to kind of briefly answer your questions, Marika, I think there is a toxic relationship between the three pillars of institutional logics, in my opinion. Patriarchy, yeah, okay, we can look at it being sort of heterosexual hyper patriarchy as one leg, but neoliberalism as another. And of course, a colonial paternalistic past. So within these three institutional logics, anything that shakes, the comfort zone, the shakes the status quo is hugely problematic. And there are penalties to each of those three institutional logics. And often, if you think intersectionally, some of them go together and you'll be all right. Some of them don't go together and you will not be all right. So for example, if you shake the institutional logic of, heteropatriarchy and neoliberalism through a decolonial lens, you produce angry feminist polemic research. But if you, perform your argument as challenging heteropatriarchy and colonial past, you might be seen as a critical feminist scholar. It's absolutely fascinating how those performative politics come into play. And there is I think there's a huge problem with people's openness with affect and emotional explorations in research. There's still so many reviewers who think autobiography is like, what's the point of that? Whereas actually it's hugely powerful, and so on and so forth. So I think my answer would be, the gatekeepers of knowledge production don't like sharing power. And I think there is an echo chamber. We want to see research that cites us. We want to see research that looks like us, that speaks to our ideas and comfort zone, or palatable versions of the same. So how comfortable are peer reviewers with discomfort? It's only when we are willing to be uncomfortable that we can receive the discomfort that has courageously been put forth by an author. And I think then there's a bigger question of how much support should be given to shape a volcanic argument into a scholarly argument. Because that's also something we think of as editors. We're not your supervisor. We're not your PhD supervisor. We can't write it for you. Don't want to shadow write it for you. How much support can we give to shape? And I think actually, we talked about this, Carin, didn't we? We should. Actually, equity, inequality, there's a difference. We need to provide that support. Perhaps we provide it differently than through the peer review process. Perhaps what we do is things like webinars. How do you put forward an argument, despite it looking uncomfortable for the reviewer, opening up those spaces. Are there any other questions that people might like to ask, whether you want to put it in chat or not? No problem. I think a really nice practical thing to put forward, is what should peer reviewers know? Yeah. What should we know when we review papers from the Global South? My takeaway when I spoke to Carin the first time, because this person is probably in the middle of the night in a cyber cafe somewhere with load shedding, and you respect that. You respect the challenges of putting forward the space and time to produce this work. That was a big one for me, really remembering it. And I think the only other reflection I have is someone said to me, all these great subaltern feminists and post-colonial scholars, they all left India and went to the US before they started writing this kind of critical scholarship. Sometimes when you're in place, it's hard to be radical. Whatever that place may be. And I don't know whether you feel this, Dhriti, but I do sometimes feel that very frustrated. I don't know if our participants feel this as well. You're looking for theorists and voices that speak to your topic, but you end up having to quote Fanon. Nothing wrong with Fanon, love his work, but it's a totally different context. I can't keep running to black skin, white mask every time I want to talk about racialized bodies. And that frustrates me.
Yeah, I think this goes back to like when I was doing my MPhil, when I was writing my MPhil dissertation. So I sort of was looking at middle class formations within a specific community, a tribal community in Assam, right? So when I had to sort of operationalize the idea of the middle class, obviously I looked at the scholarship which was already there, but then when I had to place it in the context that I was looking at, I was like at a loss. I was like, how do I, and then that was the question that was placed to me by my examiner. Like, how do you say that this community is a middle class community? Like, they don't subscribe to the definition of the middle class that we understand now, that we have sort of been knowing since forever now. So then my answer to that was, isn't it time that we question those understandings? Isn't it time that we question those definitions? So I guess that really, sometimes as an early career researcher for myself and for many of my colleagues who are now based in institutions like this, we have to tread, I guess, with a lot of caution in terms of, what kind of topics we choose, what kind of, citations, or who do we cite, because that again comes down to, very trivial or, not so trivial for our careers, when it comes down to what kind of questions would the examiners ask us? Would that cause a problem for us if we are not allowed to submit a PhD because we have used a certain kind of, say, activist sort of a position in our work, right? So that really is a big concern for me right now. And for a lot of us, I think, who are in similar sort of position in our careers right now.
Absolutely. Just as we are coming to a close, we have a few minutes. Please do consider completing this feedback form. I've just put the link in the chat. Carin already spoke about it. Great question from Ashraf. I think you joined a little bit late, but here's the question. He is from Bangladesh doing a PhD in Sydney, and he's asking for an editorial, from an editorial point of view, would we require ethics approval from Bangladesh as well as Sydney for this sort of social science project type papers? So really helpful question. One thing I will say, Ashraf, is that I've been reviewing wonderful theoretical papers recently. Some of them are done by artists who don't have any clue what, it doesn't seem to even come into their mind ethical approval is needed, because all their work is installation, performative art. So then I had to say, well, have you got any ethical approval to talk about sharing their images, sharing their quotations, and all the rest of it? So, there are different disciplinary issues there. My sense is that you would need ethical approval from your main institution where you're doing your work. So that would be Sydney. But you might very much also need to get on the ground ethical approval from your participants in Bangladesh. You might even need a second supervisory support person there. The other thing I would say is, let's also remember the do no harm kind of policy that we should think about ethically. Don't make people's life worse. At least try to shed light on things that will make their lives better. There's an ethical issue and a promise there. So when we think about researching marginalized communities, I think the moral impetus underpinning our project is actually more important than the ethical tick-boxing exercises that are safeguarding, of course, for us and others. In terms of coming to a place where we talk about not just peer reviewing Global South papers and the inequalities that already exist, are there any suggestions from the panel or participants on how we can become more attractive to Global South authors? We also want to hear from you. We also want you to publish with us. And certainly I'd say the same thing to every participant. Please do send your papers to us. We'd love to hear from you. But you see what I mean? How do we, the journal is the journal. It's located where it's located, but it has an incredibly embracing attitude. But probably, as Dhriti has said, it's not in the UGC list of journals that you might even have thought about sending something to. So how do we connect up? How do we send a message to Global South scholars that we want your work? We value your work. We want to hear from you. And certainly one takeaway from me, just chairing this event, I think I need to read more. I need to do the work. I need to get out there and read and read and read. So I educate myself and I remain reviewer ready. I need to go and do the homework to still be able to review. And where do you search? You have to keep abreast of what that looks like. Some really helpful suggestions that are the EDI meet. So just to say, the Sociological Review also has an EDI working group. We get together, we had these discussions, we want to make changes. And one thing we've really tried to do is think about partnership building between the journal and Indian journals or Latin American journals, or German journals, or journals in the continent, or journals in South Africa, where we partner up. So we create that international global network without the extractive politics, because there's no funding. We may even go for bids. There's no problem with that, but it's not the paternalistic handout, And actually, I have a suggestion for all Global South scholars. Something that people don't realize. People in the UK are desperate for international collaborators. They go for the big grants. And then like, where are your international collaborators? Oh my God, I don't have one. Quickly call Dhriti, call everybody. I need some collaborators to work with. And I would say, I say this as a Global South scholar myself, refuse. Why should you be used as a tokenistic kind of add-on? Refuse till you have equal say and equal access to generate whatever agenda that maybe you want to generate. It's a bigger game than just one thing. So please do think about maybe completing that feedback form. Tell us if you found this useful. Maybe do you want other things like this, or actually this was good enough stuff. And the only other thing I would say is please give us suggestions about how we can make real change, like real actual change in our practice. And not just have bigger discussions. Maybe the next webinar we do is practical. What are those things that we need to generate? So I know I learned a huge amount just from this discussion. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you very much. Huge thanks to our panel. Thank you to the Sociological Review. Have a wonderful rest of the day. And that's it. Thank you. Bye-bye.